All right, welcome. So glad you could make it today. Welcome to our time in the Word. I'm so thankful we can share this moment of devotional together. And today we're looking into the topic God honors. We're looking in 2 Kings 12, verses 4 through 16. If you're following along, turn to 2 Kings 12, 4 through 16. Or if you are multitasking, then feel free to listen as we'll be reading the scriptures as well. There's an old saying that goes, many people don't plan to fail, they just fail to plan. Some may fail to consider how long it will take to complete a project. Others are busy doing many things, but they don't prioritize the most important projects. We may be overwhelmed with the enormity of the task, so we put it off hoping it will take care of itself. Eventually, we reveal our priorities in the tasks we actually complete. For what we think is important, those are the things that we actually get done. So in order to understand how all this operates under our theme today, and that is God honors, we need to think about the context, what's going on here. Well, we studied in our last study together about Jehu, the king of Israel. He killed Ahaziah, the king of Judah. Ahaziah's mother, her name was Athaliah, assumed control over Judah. Jehoiada, the priest, protected Ahaziah's son, his name was Joash, from Athaliah's attempt to kill all the royal line. And this was a common practice when monarchs took to the throne during this time. They would wipe out the family line of their rivals, those who had been in power previously. Sometimes even going so far as to even taking out their servants and their household slaves. Well, after some time, Jehoiada arranged with others to crown Joash king, and Athaliah was put to death. Jehoiada then helped bring spiritual reform to Judah, and Joash served the Lord well. Joash oversaw the repair of damage that had occurred to the temple, but tragically, at the end of his reign, he forgot Jehoiada's kindness to him and murdered Jehoiada's son when the son spoke against Joash. When Joash suffered defeat from Aram, his servants conspired against him and killed him. We see a lot of strange names and a lot of bizarre fast deaths here. This is the history, the line of all these different kings that have taken place there that emphasizes with us once again. These names are not familiar to us. They're unfamiliar. We're not accustomed to them. We don't know this culture. That's why it's so important in your Bible study that you study Jewish culture and historical context so you can know when and for whom these books of the Bible have been written. Well, after this, Jehoahaz became king over Israel and regularly battled against King Hazael of Aram. And remember, Aram is what we know as Syria today. Jehoahaz's son, Joash, also followed in his father's evil ways. And during Joash's days, Elisha the prophet died. But God continued to extend grace toward his wayward people anyway. Aren't you glad that he still does that today? Meanwhile, in Judah, Amaziah became king and defeated Edom soundly. However, when he challenged Israel to battle, King Joash of Israel defeated him. And eventually Amaziah's servants conspired against him, killed him, and appointed Azariah, his son, as king. In the north, Jeroboam II became king and enjoyed military success. But he, like his predecessors before him, followed in sinful ways and practices. In Judah, Azariah, also known as Uzziah, followed the Lord and subdued the Philistines. However, the king's pride led to his attempt to usurp the priestly duties for himself. Kings were not to act as priests. And the Lord struck him with leprosy. A series of evil kings reigned over Israel. Zechariah and Shallum reigned a total of only 7 months. Menahem the king reigned 10 years, and he saw the Assyrian army invade his territory. His son Pekahiah lasted only 2 years before his servants killed him and named Pekah as his successor. During Pekah's reign, Israel and Aram joined forces against Judah and fought against both Jotham and Ahaz and Jotham's son. Tragically, instead of seeking the Lord, Ahaz sought Assyria's help. And after Damascus, Aram's capital, fell to Assyria, Ahaz traveled there to meet the king of Assyria and even built an altar in Jerusalem like the altar in Damascus. When Ahaz died, his son Hezekiah reigned over Judah. Well, now let's explore the text. Let's look at the first part of today's passage. We begin to see the problem. Looking at the problem, we'll start looking at 2 Kings chapter 12, verses 4 through 8. Starting with verse 4, Joash said to the priests, "Collect all the money that is brought as sacred offerings to the temple of the Lord, the money collected in the census, the money received from personal vows, and the money brought voluntarily to the temple. Let every priest receive the money from one of the treasurers, then use it to repair whatever damage is found in the temple." The first recorded action we see here is that Joash took in a method to demonstrate his faithfulness to God was to go and speak to the priests about repairing God's house. We see here the king prioritized repairs for the temple so everyone could worship at a place that truly honored God. The priests would oversee the project. They would not necessarily do the physical labor, but would supervise those who did. The king explained the funding for the temple repair would come from the money that came in from certain sources. And so the priests were to use the money that's brought as sacred offerings to the temple of the Lord. This translates money that's brought as a general expression to divide the money up into categories. And Joash was even going to divide it up into additional categories. So the first category, he said, was those that are brought as sacred offerings. It was part of their regular worship service. Then he said the money collected in the census. This had its origin back in Exodus chapter 30, where the Lord instructed his people to bring a half shekel per person to the sanctuary. Other worshipers might bring the money received from personal vows. Perhaps they had made a vow out of gratitude, or perhaps they had promised to bring a certain offering if God answered their prayer. The law of Moses provided detailed instructions on vows and urged the people to keep any vows they made to God. They did not have to make vows, but if they did, Ecclesiastes 5:4 through 5 specifically tells you must honor your vows. Now that's an important lesson for us today. You don't have to make a vow, but when you do, God holds it to a special standard. We must honor our vows. The king also commanded that the funding include the money brought voluntarily to the temple. Worshippers were always free to bring an offering simply because their hearts prompted them to do so. Sometimes such an offering might be a fellowship offering of an animal, but instead people might also bring a monetary gift. The king determined the silver given to the temple, either as dedicated silver or as silver voluntarily given, should adequately fund here the needed repairs. It should give enough money to do everything they needed to do to repair the temple. He even went so far as to instruct the Levites to go to Judah's cities and invite contributions above and beyond what the people had been given at the time. The king instructed, let every priest receive the money from one of the treasurers. This word treasurers can relate to a word that means to sell. And if so, this can even indicate an accountant or a bookkeeper of some sort. See, accountants and bookkeepers out there, your job is very important in the ministry of God. Very important. Others suggest the word may mean acquaintance and be a general term for coworker or neighbor. Regardless, the priest would receive the money and would distribute it appropriately to fund the various aspects of the work. These workers would take responsibility to repair whatever damage is found in the temple. Certainly, ordinary wear had occurred over the 125 years since Solomon had completed the work, and other incidents may have even caused more significant damage. In fact, the sons of evil Queen Athaliah may have even caused temple damage when they looted it to secure objects for Baal worship. That's recorded for us in 2 Chronicles chapter 24 and verse 7. So in other words, he noticed that the house of the Lord needed to be taken care of, and he wanted to use all the resources of God's people to tend to and see to God's house. That's a great and an important lesson for us today as God's people. We should always be looking out for God's house. It's so sad to see a church that has been abandoned or fallen into disrepair. That is on us as God's people. And it's important that we take care of the buildings and the structures that God has given us in our own stewardship. Well, let's look at how it continues on here, verses 6 through 8. Let's start with verse 6. But by the 23rd year of King Joash, the priest still had not repaired the temple. Therefore, King Joash summoned Jehoiada the priest and the other priests and asked them, why aren't you repairing the damage done to the temple? Take no more money from your treasurers, but hand it over for repairing the temple. The priests agreed that they would not collect any more money from the people and that they would not repair the temple themselves. This 23rd year of King Joash was 813 BC. 2 Chronicles 24:1 records that Joash became king at age 7, and he reigned for 40 years. The text does not tell us in what year Joash instructed the priest to begin the temple repair, but perhaps he had reigned a few years when he did so. Joash became impatient because the priests still had not repaired the temple. It seems likely they had failed to prioritize this important project, or perhaps even their usual duties occupied so much of their time, and they decided everything was okay as it was. But since the king was allocating financial resources here toward the project, he wanted to ensure that the money was going where it needed to go. In any case, the priests had failed to complete the repairs, and the Lord's house continued to display noticeable damage. So King Joash summoned Jehoiada the priest and the other priests, and Jehoiada is the one who had saved the king's life and nurtured him until the day that he had become king. So the two undoubtedly had a close relationship. It must have pained the king to have to call out his spiritual advisor and former guardian in front of everyone. But Joash's priority was to repair the temple, for the likely visible damage reflected poorly on the nation's relationship with their God. What do the structures and the way we take care of this structure, the body, the temple of the Holy Spirit, what does that say about how we reflect on the ministry of the gospel? How does that reflect on our relationship with God? How we treat our bodies and how we take care of our bodies, it matters. how we treat our church buildings and how we take care of our church buildings. It matters. Joash knew that, and he was prioritizing it here. And he wanted to see what, hey, the resources are there. You need to get it done. Just get it done. So Joash asked the priest, he said, why aren't you repairing the damage done to the temple? Presumably, they had no good answer, though they, more than anyone else, should have concerns over the conditions of the temple. They were the ones who served there and who functioned as mediators between God and his people. Therefore, Joash instructed the priests, he said, take no more money from the treasuries and from the treasurers. And this word treasurers, we talked about back in verse 5. He was relieving them of their duties to oversee the work. He said, instead, hand it over for repairing of the temple. In other words, the king is going to assign the task to faithful workers who have expertise in that area, who would ensure the task completion. It's a difficult thing to turn over and to delegate work on a project. Because have you ever heard the old phrase, oh, if you want something done right, you just need to do it yourself? Well, you know, that means that you're too picky. That's what that means. That just means nobody else can do it the way I want it done. Not necessarily that nobody else can do it. Nobody else can do it the way I want it done. Maybe that's what was happening here. And they were biting off more than they could chew because they were priests. They weren't builders. They weren't carpenters. They weren't engineers. They didn't know how to go about doing that. That's why it's so important to give over and to delegate to others in your life things that they can do. It not only takes pressure and stress off of you, it also gives them the ability to exercise the gifts and the talents and the abilities and the learning that God has given them. It gives them the ability to use all those in his service. It's great practice for the children of God to serve him because we're going to be doing that a very, very long time, working alongside him and laboring with the Lord Jesus Christ. Well, here we see the priests agreed to Joash's proposal. It's likely, though, that they didn't have a choice in the matter. They had failed to prioritize the king's request, and so they lost the opportunity to be a part of the solution. They agreed they would not collect any more money from the people to oversee the task. Furthermore, they would not repair the temple themselves. They had missed out on a strategic chance to advance God's work and to expand their own abilities. They could have overseen the task and even brought on other people who knew what they were doing and just checked in on the project managers and the directors and let them do their things to instruct and to organize the workers for the repair. But they had failed to prioritize the work. They had failed to delegate and get the people with the right skills in the right positions. This led to their missing out on being a part of an important aspect of ministry. Leaders are accountable for their actions. When leaders don't give tasks their due priority, others may assume those tasks are not important. Also, when leaders fall into sin, those who follow them sometimes rationalize their own failures by pointing to the leader's failures. Have you ever seen that happen before? Well, brother so-and-so did it. Sister so-and-so did it. Guess it's all right for me to do it. We must set a good example for those we lead. And if you are a child of God, you are leading someone. There's someone in your sphere of influence. There's someone out there who's looking to the way you conduct yourself and the way you live your life. They're looking to you for an example of faith, and they will follow your lead. And as their leader, you are accountable for how you lead. So now let's look at the next section. Let's look at the solution. 2 Kings 12, verses 9 through 12. We'll start looking at verse 9. Jehoiada the priest took a chest and bored a hole in its lid. He placed it beside the altar on the right side as one enters the temple of the Lord. The priests who guarded the entrance put into the chest all the money that was brought to the temple of the Lord. Following the king's directive, Jehoiada the priest instituted a new system to fund the temple repairs. He created a designated offering box that would collect the money people gave toward the work, and that money would go directly to the workers. So Jehoiada took a chest and he bored a hole in its lid. We should assume that this chest was fairly large because we're talking about a large number of worshipers and a large number of them even wanting to contribute, no doubt, above and beyond. Many worshipers would want to contribute, so a large chest made sense. The Bible tells us that Jehoiada placed it beside the altar on the right side as you enter the temple of the Lord. The altar mentioned here was likely a smaller altar or even one of the pillars that stood outside the temple of the courtyard. This is talked about in 2 Chronicles 24 and verse 8. This area was supervised by the priests who guarded the entrance of the temple. That is, they monitored access to the sacred ground on which the temple stood. These officials here then put into the chest all the money that was brought to the temple of the Lord. Over the years, churches to which we've belonged sometimes have initiated special projects. Members have been challenged to support the project with designated gifts beyond their usual contributions. Doing so gives everyone an opportunity to participate in the advancement of God's work. Listen, every contribution is important, no matter how small. Every contribution is important. Worshippers in Joash's day who brought their designated offerings to the temple, no doubt, shared the same sense of responsibility. The Bible tells us to bring all the tithes into the storehouse. Why? Well, the Old Testament did it. Why? Because it takes money to operate the house of God. It takes money to pay the workers who come in there to do the work. It takes money to pay the light bill and the electric bill and the water bill and whatever other kinds of bills that go along with the structure. It's personnel, it's resources, it's materials, it's the building, it's repairs, it's upkeep, it's maintenance, it's the bus, it's what the list goes on and on and on. If God's people aren't faithful in tithing, those items can hurt. Some of them may even fail. And when that happens, it hurts the overall ministry of the church. And sometimes we forget that. We just think, oh, the Bible tells me to bring my tithe in. Well, yeah, but there's a reason for it. God wants his workers taken care of. He wants his house taken care of. He wants his resources taken care of. So when we enter into a new project, whatever church you may be part of, whenever you enter into a new project, sometimes they'll say, we're going to have a funding drive or a giving drive to fund this new project. Why? Because it's above and beyond what it takes to just run the everyday operation of the church. That's done with the tithes. The offerings are used for other special items that may be occurring. They understood that. The Israelites understood that, and they were bringing in their offerings above and beyond to help fund the repairs for the temple. So now let's go on and look at verses 10 and 12 together. Let's look at verse 10. Whenever they saw that there was a large amount of money in the chest, the royal secretary and the high priest came, counted the money that had been brought into the temple of the Lord, and put it into bags. When the amount had been determined, they gave the money to the men appointed to supervise the work on the temple. With it, they paid those who worked on the temple of the Lord, the carpenters and the builders, the masons and the stonecutters. They purchased timber and blocks of dressed stone for the repair of the temple of the Lord, and they met all the other expenses of restoring the temple. See here, the priests took action. Whenever they saw there was a large amount of money in the chest. They had designated officials. Did you notice the plural there? They were officials. There was a royal secretary and a high priest. There was at least two, no doubt, often more. That's why it's so important in the money processes of the church that there are checks and balances. For no one is perfect and no one is above temptation. That's why it's so important to have checks and balances all along the way when it comes to the tithes and the offerings of the Lord. Well, the secretary and the high priest, these two officials, they would count the money that had brought in the temple of the Lord. They would put it into bags. This word that is translated secretary is sometimes translated as scribe. It comes from a verb that means to count. Such individuals typically were in charge of keeping important records, and they were well known to those in the royal court. Some churches have jobs, they have positions that are titled counters or treasurer. Those are all important aspects of ministry, integral aspects of ministry. Such individuals here were typically in charge of keeping these important records, and the high priest bore the responsibility as the temple representative to ensure that those records were accurate in their accounting. Having the king's secretary and the high priest involved in the process ensured both palace and priesthood oversaw the project and provided mutual accountability. Mutual accountability is key when it comes to the Lord's work and to handling the Lord's finances. Once they had gathered the funds, Jehoiada and the king's secretary gave the money to the men appointed to supervise the work on the temple. The priests had failed to oversee the work, so now the money would go directly to those who oversaw the repairs being done. These overseers paid those who worked on the temple of the Lord, that is, to those doing the physical repair work. The money thus went from those who were accounted for it to the supervisor of the workers and then on to the workers themselves. It reached the people it needed to reach to fund the work of the ministry. The text here mentions four specific groups of workers. First, it talks about the carpenters. This word carpenter literally means workers of wood. Jesus Epitropus, that is his foster father Joseph, was a carpenter. He was a worker of wood, which meant Jesus likely as well had great skills when it came to carpentry. If they patterned their work after that in Solomon's day, they likely worked with cedar. Cedar was one of the favorite types of wood that they worked with in this day. Second, the text goes on to mention the builders. This talks about general construction workers. They can apply their many skills where they were needed and support the work of others as they did the actual building and labor that it took to put things together. The third group was the masons. These were craftsmen who were skilled in working and in shaping and carving brick and stone. They could also lay it and they could have a foundation. They were very important parts of the building process. They could help repair breaches in the temple as well. And then fourth, there were the stone cutters who would work with stones of all sizes. That is, they could reshape the stones to repair damaged areas in the temple to make sure they were cut precisely, or maybe even shape them in some other form that might be needed in a certain area of the temple. The supervisors here also used the designated offering to purchase timber and blocks of dressed stone for the repair of the temple of the Lord. They purchased all the materials that the skilled craftsmen needed and all the materials they used to complete the work. There's so many materials that are purchased behind the scenes in the church that we often don't realize that enables the workers, the laborers, to have the materials they need to do their labors, to do their ministry. All the other expenses of restoring the temple also came from this fund, the Bible tells us in this passage. This expression likely refers to the many incidental costs that arise during the work on this significant project. And if you've ever done a remodeling project in your life, you know there are incidental costs that come up, costs you didn't expect, or even changes in the cost of certain things along the way. God expects his people to take care of their financial obligations. Jesus challenged us to use our earthly resources to invest in eternity. He talks about that very clearly in Matthew 6, verses 19 through 21. People who sacrifice generously to give to God's work find that they can never outgive God. His blessing on our lives far exceeds anything that we can give and anything that we can do. At the same time, churches should strategically invest and plan their budgets. Each local church must prayerfully determine how to allocate its resources for maximum kingdom impact. The budgeting process, even though it may be tedious and even though it may be exhausting and mind cramping, it is a very important and vital aspect of the church's life. Well, now let's go on to the next section here, the last section, 2 Kings 12, verses 13 through 16. We see here the action that starts taking place. The action that starts taking place. Verse 13. The money brought into the temple was not spent for making silver basins, wick trimmers, sprinkling bowls, trumpets, or any other articles of gold or silver for the temple of the Lord. It was paid to the workers who used it to repair the temple. The king no doubt wanted to ensure here that the people who gave money for the temple's repair would see the result of their investment. And as a result of that, items like silver basins, wick trimmers, sparkling bowls, trumpets, any other articles of gold or silver that normally would see service in the ongoing worship and sacrifices of the temple that people likely, most of them would not even see, some of them, were financed by other temple funds during the temple repair project. That way people could see what was being done with their funding there. Indeed, many such items played an important role in worship, but they were funded by the temple treasury, not by the designated funds that were given by God's people. Only when the contributions to repair the damage exceeded the need did the remaining funds go to the temple items. So when they had some excess, some leftover, then they funded some of those other temple items. The money the people gave for the designated offering was paid to the workers who used it to repair the temple. In earlier days, Joash had commissioned the priests with the duty to repair the temple damage, but the priests had failed. Consequently, Joash established a special offering under the supervision of both palace and temple. This money that came in went directly to pay the people who bought materials for the work and to pay the workers who actually did the work. So now let's look at verses 15 and 16 as we wrap up our time in the Word today. Verse 15, they did not require an accounting from those to whom they gave the money to pay the workers, because they acted with complete honesty. The money from the guilt offerings and sin offerings was not brought into the temple of the Lord. It belonged to the priests. As we talked about earlier, these representatives of both palace and temple, they monitored and recorded the total amount of money that was being brought in here. They had these checks and balances in place. That way they could always know and be able to even give an accounting for what came in and where it was dispersed. However, they did not require an accounting for those for whom they gave the money to pay the workers. At least two officials, one from the palace, one from the temple, knew how much money went into the project. But those who supervised the work, they acted with complete honesty. So no accounting was required from them. A believer's integrity in business. That's what we're talking about here. A believer's integrity in business can further or it can hinder the cause of God's kingdom. When we display integrity in all walks of life, People recognize that we are trustworthy. When believers exhibit integrity, even in small matters, many in the world take notice. The character trait of integrity, it's important. It grows in a person over time, but it can be lost quickly by one foolish choice, just a single one. Believers should always pray that God will help them to live lives of integrity in all matters of life. The text also notes here that the money from the guilt offerings and the sin offerings was not brought into the temple of the Lord for the repair project. The book of Leviticus provides detailed instructions relating to both the sin offering and the guilt offering. You can see those in Leviticus chapter 4 through chapter 6 and in Numbers chapter 5. With each sacrifice, a portion was burned on the altar, and the rest of the offering belonged to the priests. This was God's way of providing for the priests and their families. The text here makes it plain that Joash's and Jehoiada's work to oversee the repair of the temple damage did not result in disregarding the stipulations and the directions from the law of Moses. The priests kept the portions of the offerings to which they were entitled, and the temple repair work was funded through the designated offerings the people brought to the temple. The key idea, the key doctrine that we can take away from this today is this: each congregation operates under the lordship of Christ through a democratic process, with each member responsible and accountable to Jesus Christ as Lord. That word Lord means boss. And faithfulness in giving of each member in the local church, that is, in their time, in their talents, and in their treasure. These are vital to the health of the church and the furtherance of the gospel. Well, thanks for joining me for today's time in the Word. I pray the Lord will bless today's devotional to your heart as He has to mine. I do encourage you to like and comment. I always love to go back and see who's been watching and to read your comments and to hear your insights from the study today. Also, if you're watching on YouTube, I encourage you to click subscribe so you can know anytime that a video is posted, and click that bell icon there to be notified whenever new Bible study videos are posted. Thanks again for joining for today's time in the Word, and until next time, be sure to have your own time in the Word each and every day.